before we dive right in, I know this week is Teacher Appreciation Week, and I wanted to make sure that we thank all of our teachers that have logged on today, because we know that especially during this time of distance learning, you all have been on the forefront in supporting our students and parents and families. And so just want to let you know that your work has not been unseen. And we felt that it was really, really important to do a topic such as this today to help provide support and also just talk about some recommendations around this new normal of distance learning. Just to begin, this event is sponsored by Bunifu Learning for Life. The webinar today is entitled Challenges, Innovations, and Opportunities During COVID-19. I do want to walk you through the webinar platform so we make sure that we have the best webinar experience. All participants have been muted, but we are going to use the chat function. This is where you can submit any questions at any time. We are going to ask for your participation as well throughout the event. And so please make sure that you use the chat function as we go through. There is a Q&A function, but try to stay with the chat function. I will try to toggle back and forth, but it'll be easier for me if you just go ahead and use the chat. For many of you, just to test the chat, if you would go ahead and give your name, and we have a dog in the background. Our panelist Lillian has a dog and sitting in the background, so you may hear that throughout the presentation today. But during the chat, if you could just submit your name and then where you're from. Now, at the end of today's webinar, there will be a follow-up email. I wanted to make sure that you had a copy of today's presentation and also tools and resources to support your work in the school. We want to also make sure that any future webinars that we have, that their quality, that we provide quality presentations and webinar events. So please make sure that you complete the post-evaluation. There's 2 questions in that post-evaluation that are open-ended questions. I know I like to skip those questions. So just adding to say there's additional topics that if you want to talk about. Also sharing, we're going to ask you to share recommendations. As you've gone through distance learning, I'm sure you have recommendations, or you may have want to ask questions or advice, and we're going to share this out anonymously with the folks that are here on today's webinar event. I see a lot of people. We have Max from San Diego Unified, Charles, who's from our DC Small Business, and Stephanie, who's from Washington State. Excited, very, very excited to have all of you on today's webinar. So again, today's webinar is entitled Challenges, Innovations, and Opportunities. We have a great panel, and when I thought about pulling this panel together, I wanted to make sure that they were from different areas of the United States and that they had a background and expertise of over 20 to 30 years in making sure that they are providing equity and culturally competent best practices. And so I'm excited because they have a wealth of information. They're also going to talk about the challenges of this new normal, because this is also new for them. Things are changing every day. And so I think it's about a conversation, and we also are looking to you as being experts on this webinar. So we're going to look at first, talk about a little bit about Bunifu, because I'm sure you have not heard about Bunifu and the work that we're doing. Then we'll look at research and trends in the news. We're going to look at a culturally relevant framework, and then we're going to talk about tips, tools, best practices, and supports for creating culturally relevant distance learning environments. So the mission of Bunifu is essentially, we felt like learning is power. And so online learning is a way to engage both adults as well as student learners. And so we feel that providing the right knowledge and the right information can help organizations meet their goals and achieve success. We essentially provide consultation and development and management of e-learning modules and toolkits for schools and businesses. We specifically want to look at businesses that want to engage diverse learners or schools that want to engage diverse learners. We have a framework of culturally competent framework where we look at learners' cultural background, their social and historical diverse background. We believe that diversity is an asset. So now let's really get into today's topic. I usually will introduce our panelists today, but I would not give it justice. I want each of our panelists to kind of give a little bit about their background, their context, you know, what they're passionate about, and then the work that they do within their state and school and within their district, and just a little bit about how they got to this point and what they're doing as far as cultural competence and equity. So we're going to start with Olu, who will begin introducing himself, and then we'll move through the panel. Olu?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. First and foremost, it's a pleasure to be able to provide any significant information to the panel. My background, I have over 20 years of experience in K through college education. I've taught in multiple school districts from Memphis City Schools, the Atlanta Public Schools, as well as the Miami-Dade County Public Schools. I'm currently now a consultant. I work with the Miami-Dade County Public Schools here, doing teacher training, staff development, research development, things of that nature. I come from a humble beginnings from the state of Mississippi. I was born in Mississippi, but my family and I matriculated to Chicago. So I'm a product of the Chicago public school system, first generation student myself, first person in my family to go to college. And ultimately, I received my PhD from Georgia State University in educational policy studies. So that's my passion. My passion is centered around restorative justice, zero tolerance school policies, and I do a lot of work around restorative justice and human development. Thank you.
I guess that means I'm up. Thank you very much. And thank you, Jennifer, for allowing me to join this leadership panel. What a great opportunity. As I introduce myself, I like to introduce myself in a cultural way. Yate Ianshagni Shedene. My birth name is Yellow Woman. My clan is Bitter Water, but I was born for the Danish people. And in Navajo culture, or Dene, we introduce ourselves and our clan so we see who we're related to out there. So I've introduced my clan, and as I had stated, I'm born for the Danish people. So that makes you aware that my father is Caucasian or white. I was born on the Navajo Nation. I have a great passion around services and supports for our American Indian Alaskan Native students. A lot of my work is focused on that. I am currently the Equity, Justice, and Inclusion Director at Weber School District. I'm also on the Governor's Multicultural Commission. The commission supports the Governor's Multicultural Affairs Office, which later in this webinar will introduce a report that came out of the MCA office. Formerly, prior to the work at Weber School District, I was at the Utah State Board of Education, which is our Department of Ed for the state of Utah. In this work, I oversaw programs and specialists in the area around school-based mental health that included suicide prevention, substance abuse prevention, school safety, student support, school counseling programs, equity, and restorative practices. An incredible team and a great opportunity to support this state of Utah. I've also been fortunate enough to be a part of great work nationally and statewide. Jennifer, I worked with you on that Young Men of Color project as part of College Board, so I appreciated that opportunity. It was such a growing experience, or growth experience for myself as well. I worked with West Ed. They incorporated some of my training and professional development for educators to support American Indian Alaskan Native students. Been able to be a part of some professional development for our Bureau of Indian Ed Schools as well. So you can see my passion come out there. The last 2 years, or about 2 years ago, I was an advisor for a local school district, which was Weber School District. And helping support them in their growing need of equity, justice, and inclusion. And I so admired their work and their commitment, their leadership, the superintendent, and all that they were doing around developing an initiative, and beyond an initiative, a whole movement around equity, justice, and inclusion. And that synergy was something that I wanted to be a part of. And through a process, they hired me as their new director. So my position is new this year. And what an interesting year to have all this happen as we're experiencing COVID and what that means, and how we make these adjustments. But the space that I'm in has allowed me to reconnect with my cultural awareness and my own cultural responsibility. And it has allowed me to get closer to staff and students. And it's been an incredible journey of growth, self-awareness, and I've been able to hear just some wealth of heartfelt stories. And in my 30 years of education, I think that this project, this job assignment has probably impacted me the most, which is very interesting to say after the journey that I've been on at a national level and a state level. So I just thank you to all the educators who have chimed in today, and thank you for all the work you're doing out there.
Well, good morning, buenos dias, yo soy Chenia, which is good morning for Yaqui. I'm Chicano, which is like Mexican American. I'm Yaqui and I'm California Indian. You know, I grew up here in San Diego. I was born in the Bay, so, you know, hello to all my Bay Area folks out there, and to all my West Coast folks that are online right now. Thank you for showing up. I really appreciate all of you. I have about 14 years at the San Diego Unified School District. I currently work for the Restorative Justice Practices Department, and prior to working for the Restorative Justice Practices Department, I actually got to do the Race and Human Relations and Advocacy, and that's where I met Ms. Dunn. I got to travel with her to Miami, where I was a panelist talking about young men of color, and now I'm got the fortunate to be on here. And you know, a little bit about me. I'm an activist. I've been an activist, second generation. My mother and father fought in anti-war movements, and also for the Chicano movement back in the 60s and the 70s. And I've had some big shoes to fill, and I've been, ever since, been fighting for the people. That is my main thing. What I do now with the Restorative Justice Practices Department is my thing is to disrupt the school to prison pipeline, which is a real thing. Having worked and volunteered in the juvenile facilities here in San Diego, I get to see that there's a direct connection between those students who have been disengaged, who have dropped out of school, and we look at the same demographics when they're lining up every morning from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. in the afternoon, Monday through Friday, ready to see their juvenile judge. It's the same demographics, the same people, and I'm just trying to do my part and trying to make sure that we don't have any more of people from my community, any community at that, start off their teenage life and entering into their adult life, starting off in the system. I want them to be able to go to college. I want them to be able to have a career path that's going to better our community, better their own family circumstances, and be able to uplift us out of this cycle of violence and this cycle of poverty that I find many of my people in today. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you for the great introductions. And I think that this is just going to lend itself and the backgrounds of our participants to this next slide that I'm going to talk about. So I just pulled a couple of article headings and news headings from things that have just been coming out. I think it's a good representation of what's going on as far as education. And as far as the population or underrepresented groups, traditionally underrepresented groups. And when we talk about traditionally underrepresented groups, we talk about the Latinx community, African or Black community, our Native Indian communities that are out there. and how we're supporting them. And so, you know, if you look at that first bullet, it talks about racial disparities in COVID-19 and the impact, and the data was slowly emerging. It would seem that we would have disaggregated the data a long time ago to look at certain populations to make sure that we're targeting certain communities and providing support. But only, as you can see with the date, April 9th, about almost a month ago, less than a month ago, we then started looking at and the importance of disaggregating this data about who's impacted by COVID-19. And that's an important thing to do as you're thinking about your schools and you're thinking about the work that you are doing, is looking at populations that may be underrepresented at your school, within your district, or organization. Also, I just want to, you know, I'm not going to go through each of the articles, but one of the big things the Navajo Nation confirms. Now, this, I just pulled this from the Navajo Department of Health, but a lot of times our Native students are not represented in the data. And so it's really important, if you have Native students at your school, how are you reaching out to them? What are the contexts in which they're living in? I think that's really important as we look at the disaggregated data. But I wanted to just highlight that to make sure that you're not missing anybody within your population. And that's the first thing, is to start having conversations around the data, especially during distance learning. Who has access? Who doesn't have access? How are we targeting and pulling those populations and looking at race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic level? So the next thing I really wanted to highlight was, even during these challenging times, there have been educators and districts that have been doing things that have been innovative, and they've used this time as an opportunity to innovate. Where we were looking at Rochester School District, they saw that there was no internet for some students, so they started using the yellow buses and creating hotspots, connecting. Some school districts started to connect with businesses or companies to increase internet access for their students. Also, I think it's really important. We're talking about distance learning. We now are in schools where students we're using Zoom. We just had a crisis and then we responded to it. And so this next bullet, as far as unproductive debate about synchronous versus asynchronous learning, is really important. It's about how people learn. Right now, we are in we are doing a synchronous type of online thing where you are getting information, but you are also getting an opportunity to ask questions throughout the webinar in real time. And it's very important that students get both of those things, that you're just not putting up videos, that they're just not, you know, being on a Zoom call, but they're able to get engaging information, and they have to have both, and both of them lend itself to something different. And then the last, I'm just going to talk about the last bullet here. It's time to accept the point of school has changed. You know, I've heard from some educators, and I've been an educator for over 20 years, and I would sit and I would say, you know what? We're going back to business as usual. Nothing is going to change. And so in the fall, will it be business as usual, or do we need to change something? There was things that were broken prior to distance learning, and there's something that we need to change to make sure that now that we've had this catalyst happen, maybe distance learning is a good thing for students, and how do we help and support them through this? And what will the fall, and how will we prepare for the fall? The last data slide I do want to show is about disaggregated data. I want to look at disaggregated data based on ethnicity and subgroups because it's important to be able to target populations. The Pew Research Center put out some information about socioeconomic level, as well as ethnic and racial backgrounds, and who had broadband access for school-age children. As you can see, for our Black, Hispanic, Latinx students, they lack that high-speed connection at home. And what does that mean for your students and families? And what do you do to engage them? Other than maybe sending out a packet. Okay, so how do you change that paradigm and make it inclusive for all students? And we're going to talk a little bit about that later. So I do want to start off before the panelists, so we get into deep into our discussion, is I want you to take a moment and look at the slide here. Now, this is something that I used to do in my psychology class when I talked about perspective. What do you see here? Could you go ahead and chat into the chat feature and tell me what do you see on this slide? Go ahead and take a moment and tell me what do you see on this slide? Okay, somebody said, Henry said, a woman inside of her face, a young lady, some see an old woman, a girl looking away to the left, a young and old woman, a piece of cauliflower. And I think this slide, essentially, many of you are seeing different things. You see different profiles. And as we are thinking about cultural competence, we bring in something different based on who we are. And so this is talking about perspective based on your experience or what you see. And there's no right or wrong answer. Yes, you see an older woman, you see a woman with a profile, you see a young woman in this picture, but it's about your perspective and how do we empower our students when they come with a certain perspective or a certain background. And so I clearly want to just talk about this framework because our panelists are going to essentially talk about how they're using this framework in the work that they're doing. It's important to make sure that you're looking at communities or the population or students and families that you work with in context. That means, what is the family makeup? Is it a single family home? Are there multi-generations within that family? How are they in a suburban or urban or rural area? And how are you meeting those needs based on a student's context? Cultural competence. What are the value systems based on that culture or traditions or customs? Base that on those culture, and how are you bringing that into your distance learning? So you're making sure that you're empowering students and affirming where they come from. And sometimes that starts with you. You have to look at your perspective in order to see somebody else's. System-wide, we're all in a system. We're in a school system. Sometimes systems are not just structures, they're also practices that we've been doing for years that just seems like a system. That's not really a policy, but it's the way we've always done it. So I think it's really, really important that we look at the context of where our students are coming from and our own systems in order to be able to address that. That's meaning, how are we looking at as far as distance learning? Who has access to internet? Who doesn't? What is the systems that are put in place? How are we communicating? Okay, system-wide, to make sure that everyone is getting the messaging that is necessary. Data is so important. I already talked a little bit about data and the importance of disaggregating it to make sure that we're targeting certain student groups. So I'm going to go ahead and move over and talk to our panel. They're going to talk about COVID-19. They are going to talk about some challenges that they've been having around equity and cultural competence and some of the things that they're doing to support that. So I'm going to start off with Lillian.
Thank you, Jennifer. What you can see here on the slide is a report, and I believe that in the resources we have a link so you can look at this report in detail. But this report is a reflection of a collaborative effort between the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs, the Utah Multicultural Commission, which I'm a part of, and the Utah Martin Luther King Jr. Human Rights Commission. So a really great collaboration. And the report is meant to establish a baseline of immediate needs and unique barriers faced by our marginalized community in the state of Utah during this COVID-19 outbreak, as well as to serve as a tool to inform our state leadership and how we could come together and work together to solve some of these concerns. Interesting data piece, which, you know, I don't know that it's something that's new, but certainly the data can allow us to guide our practices around the overarching themes that came out in the report. The psychological safety safety needs, language and literacy, the accessibility around that, the coordination of information, and to get that information out there in different languages so we can make sure we are allowing communities to have the proper information, the cultural, mindful, and inclusive practices, which I've really appreciated as being a part of the Navajo Nation. And the Navajo Nation actually spreads out over 4 different states. And so in the southern part of the state, we have a large population of Navajos and Ute and Ute Mountain Utes. And so they're highly impacted, as you had mentioned earlier in the slide. Interesting enough, the Navajo population is probably one of the largest tribes, or it is the largest tribe in the US. We have over 300,000 members, but only about 175,000 live on the reservation proper. But we are very tied to our communities. And as I'm talking about this, I want you to think about parallels in other communities because of our ties to our homeland. Other people have ties to their family and their homeland. In my case, the numbers and the data is 2 out of 10 people who live on the reservation there, Navajo people, have died. And I'm just pausing there to reflect that. So even in my own family, I've had 7 people who've been affected and 4 have died just within my own family. So what does that mean when we talk about these culturally mindful practices and approaches? And that as we're talking, and Jennifer, you mentioned this earlier, even though, you know, some of the students that are here in our state, they could be out in your state as well, how is that affecting them? Because they have such a strong tie to family, as many of us do. And what are those guiding practices that you need to be very culturally mindful of as we move forward and support our students? The other pieces that came out of that, I think you can see in the next couple of slides. And as I said, you can read this a little bit further. The outcome of this were really some unique barriers that were around access to computers and technology and some food insecurities. And, you know, with the loss of job, you know, a lot of our members of our community are skilled workforce. And, you know, in my own district, we've done a lot of food drops so that our families in need don't have to go out, but they not only are getting their free lunch for their children, but also getting food drops out to the families in need. And just helping them with some technology pieces. And many of the other panelists, as we were prepping for this, it was great to hear what they were doing. Schools trying to fit that niche and to fill those needs for those students and making sure they have access and information. And really the schools are kind of that source of where are they getting information. And some of that you can see in the report. Other sources of information come from church and family and friends. But we are a part of a community. And as we look at systems, as Jennifer said, we really need to, in our school, think about systemic approach. And not only is it parent engagement, but it's whole community engagement to be able to support our students.
Thank you, Lillian. So we're going to go ahead and pass it over to Olu, who's going to talk a little bit about the barriers in technology. Olu, you're muted. Let me unmute you. There you go.
Yes, I just want to put it into context a little. Miami-Dade County Public Schools are the 4th largest public school district in the country. We have over 392 schools, 345,000 students with over 40,000 employees. And 70% of the students are Hispanic or, and which is, you know, when it comes down to language barriers, that's critical. Because you have over 31% of the students out of that 70% that are English learners. You know, they're learning English for the first time. So down here, we're having problems with actually getting the information out to the parents and the families in order to support the students' learning. In order to engage them, we have to first and foremost get over that language barrier. And that's one of our biggest problems here is articulating this information to these families, trying to get as much information out here as possible throughout the community that these students and families are currently in. And it's unfortunate that that even though the technology that we use and through Zoom and other different online platforms are readily available to our students, because according to the research that I've done, over 90% of the students have logged in. That means that they have access to the online platform, but logging in alone is not an indicator of learning. So a lot of our students do not have the language in order to really communicate with the teachers that they are trying to provide this information to. A lot of the parents are struggling because they're not English speakers at all. So we're having a tough time down here in Miami dealing with language. And as far as the culturally relevant experience through Zoom, I think first and foremost, we have to realize that presence is important. We have to set the tone and allow our students to be self-reflective. And as teachers, we have to be self-reflective. We also have to engage our students in ways in which they probably wouldn't have had an opportunity to do before. For example, seeing you in your home, you know, is a culturally relevant thing, to be able to showcase where you live as opposed to where they live, and having conversations around their living conditions and their well-being, and supporting them from a psychological standpoint, as opposed to trying to teach for aptitude. We need to really, really focus on attitude. We need to focus on what is it that we can do now to help build that intestinal fortitude, to help build that resilience that our students are in such need of in this in this time. Because to be frank, they're in a crisis. A lot of our students are at home, and they're suffering from a food desert situations. A lot of them don't have food to eat. So we have to talk to the students and their parents about how can we connect more on a personal level in order to engage them from an educational perspective.
Mario?
Well, one of the good things that we've been able to do here in San Diego Unified School District is the first thing we did is that we started handing out food. So from Monday through Friday, from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., we've been giving out food. We've been giving out breakfast and lunch to the students, and we have 24 locations all throughout our district. Being that we are the second largest district in the state, we have over 104,000 students, and we have an obligation to feed our students. The other thing is that we've been given Chromebooks, and we've been able to get those Chromebooks out to students. In the beginning, though, we had an issue of students not wanting to come pick them up. We thought by getting the message out through the news, through through recorded phone calls going home, through pamphlets being emailed or mailed home, that parents and students were going to get the message. But what we found out was, unless we actually called students, unless we actually called parents and actually had a conversation with parents, no one was coming to pick them up. We had less than 50% of the students coming to pick up their computers within the first couple of weeks. It wasn't until we started making those phone calls and started actually having conversations and letting the parents know why the importance of continuing their education. Now, right now, we have a grade policy protection, which means that students grades cannot go down, and they can only go up. As of when the COVID started in March, when we had our shutdown. But that doesn't mean that education should just start, because what we're going to see if we don't get our students engaged is we're going to see an even wider gap between those with an education and those with not, and which will increase and continue our cycle of poverty. So, one of the things that Olu said is definitely, we have to change our attitude and how we engage with students. And I will be talking more about that in a later slide. but we have to connect with them. We have to build our relationships with them, especially now. We have households in which these aren't, the learning is not, what should I say, is not ideal for a learning environment. You know, we have to we have to understand and work with our families and figure out how can we best create a learning environment, because there's the, you know, the idea that some of our schools may still not be in session. I mean, you know, come next fall, that we still may be doing distance learning. So we have to use right now as an opportunity to prepare for that. And I'll be talking more about that as we go into. And just so some of the things that we're using right now is like Zoom, Google Class, Seesaw, Flipgrid, Padlet, and some other applications that have been great. And I'll be talking more about that in later.
Thank you. So, you know, I think those are just some of the challenges and some of the solutions. But one of the things as we were prepping for this webinar was about the personal connection. I want the attendees to take an opportunity to talk about how they are building personal connections with their students. If you could just chat in to the chat box and say, what are some ways that you are building connections with your students? I know that there's challenges because it's hard to build a connection. And many students who are from underrepresented backgrounds, they want that personal connection. Before they move forward to anything else, they want to be connected to that adult. They want you to be authentic with who you are, and they want to, and that's the way that they are connecting with you. But how can you do that when there's this barrier of this virtualness that's going on? And so we're going to talk a little bit about personal connection. And I really love this part because this is where our presenters are really going to be passionate about what they're seeing in schools, what they saw before in schools, face to face, and then what they're seeing now. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Olu.
Well, first and foremost, it's critical that we understand as educators that a child, any child, has to feel accepted by you, because you can't truly teach a child if you don't love that particular child. You have to show that love through everything that you do. You have to embrace the fact that they come with their different challenges. We all do, but we have to admit to ourselves, be self-reflective enough and caring enough within our hearts to understand that it's, as the adults initiating this education, this learning, this platform, it has to start with us. We have to personalize our experiences. We have to make sure that everything that we do and everything that we say is situated in not only our own personal experiences, but also bringing in the personal experiences of the child, because the ultimate thing is for the child to understand that their story is their power. Their power resides in their story. When they're able to engage themselves in the learning that you're trying to develop, especially on this online platform, you have to encourage them to talk about their story and empower them by letting them know that their story is their power. And also being solution driven. This is unprecedented. We've never been in a situation like this, ever. So we have to start thinking outside of the box. We have to be truly more student-centered when it comes down to developing solutions in order to truly connect and engage our students.
Thank you, Olu. We did have some other folks that came in and said, you know, about their personal connection. And I think, Olu, you made a great point. It's about not only being self-aware about what you think, but also being self-aware about loving a student. And you know, that sounds kind of cliche about loving a student, but sometimes students can be challenging, whether they're distance learning or face-to-face. And then how and why is that? Looking at the context and the cultural competence, and how are we empowering them to be solution-driven? Many of you say that you are attendees, you are posting video messages on YouTube for your students. You're calling them twice a week, giving your own personal phone number. I mean, now we're upright and personal. We're in people's homes, okay? We're also checking text. Many students aren't using email And most students don't. They're used to texting. They're used to using, platforms like TikTok and so forth to communicate with one another. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mario, and he's going to talk a little bit about his personal connection.
Thank you. It's right now the most dire time that we need. Like I said before, we do not want to see the gap widen between those with and those without. We want to be able to keep our students engaged. And right now, because of the circumstances that we're dealing with right now, we need to engage our students directly. And I'm going to give you some reasons why. And Rita Pearson, who does a TED Talk, and Every Child Needs a Champion, she says, kids don't learn from people they don't like. And that goes along with what Olu was saying. If they didn't like you before, you need to figure out how you're going to be able to get them to like you now, because it's even more. We don't have the the carrot out there that students need to show up, because if they don't show up to class, they don't show up to school, they're going to get truant, and then somebody's going to be making a phone call home. We need to figure out how do we engage our students, and for numbers of reasons, and not just for the academic, but for the social emotional reasons as well. And I'm going to give you some ideas why. One of the things that we do in here as a counselor is that we do we need to address the social emotional stuff. So one of the things that I actually wanted to do is show the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And basically, the Maslow hierarchy of needs is the psychological needs that are happening right now, which is not being done. We're being impacted. Olu said that people are not getting their food. Some people are not getting the type of shelter that they need. Some people are, because their rent here in California, people are allowed to not pay their rent. But as I've noticed, is that not every state has the same thing. Sleep, clothing, safety needs, personal security, employment is a factor right now. Love and belonging, friendship. Many of my students feel alone right now. They're in circumstances where they haven't even left their own bedroom, and so that love and belonging. If you live in a family where you were dealing with circumstances that were not ideal, now you're stuck. So the self-esteem aspect, and all of these are preludes to self-actualization, where the creativity and the learning actually happen. So if these things aren't happening, then the students aren't ready to learn. And we need to talk about the ACEs. So one of the things that I would like to talk about is like adverse childhood experiences, because this is something that is now being used in our medical fields, but it's something that we need to start paying attention to, even especially now, because some of our students already had a 4 or above, and 4 to 7 is already high when we talk about the adverse childhood experiences. But one of the things is now some of our students, if you look at some of the questions that are being used, some of our students now are going above 7. And we need to understand that emotional, that adverse childhood experience, the impact that is going on right now is crucial. And if you just look at some of the things like, do you get sweared at? Do you get insulted by somebody in your house? Some of our students cannot escape their house now. And so it is dire that we now figure out ways in order to connect with our students on a social emotional level. Because if we don't, then we are going to see the school to prison pipeline is going to go up. Our kids are going to get more into the system than we want them. And we all know that once you're in the system, it is 2 times as much harder to get out of the system as a juvenile, and 4 times more likely that you will end up in an adult institution. So because of these things, because of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because of the adverse childhood experiences, we're at a point right now that we need to be able to go into what we have now, which is our social emotional gap. And solutions, part of the solutions that I have right now is that I've been using Zoom as a way to check in with my students. Part of what we've been doing is doing check-in circles. Now, these are students who I've been working with already that have already learned how to build community within their own classrooms, have learned how to build community within their own family. And now I'm asking these students to learn how to build community via Zoom so that they can go and connect with with other students, they can connect with their teachers, teaching our teachers how to connect on Zoom, but empowering our students to first do it. I believe that. And later on, I'm going to talk about how we need to be able to support our educators as well. Because if we don't support our educators, then the cup is going to always be empty when the demand needs our cups to be full. But for now, right now, our focus needs to be on making sure that we give our basic needs are met for our students, feeding them, shelter, safety. Those are really crucial right now as we think about the work that is going on right now in our school and our communities.
So, I think, both Olu and Mario spoke a lot about the students in context and making sure that we connect to students on a personal level. And I think it's also important to understand that, yes, we have to have empathy for students, but not sympathy for students. So we still need to be about business of educating students, but also educating them, understanding the context and the framework of where they're coming from. And how do we do that and connect with? So in distance learning, it's not, okay, yeah, we know that grades don't mean anything for some students and they're feeling a lack of motivation. But
Right.
But how are we coming and presenting the information in the Zoom meeting or within a self-paced course? What are we doing to show that, hey, education is still going because I think you're important enough to make sure that we're providing the rigor that is necessary, but I'm also here in providing the supports. Now, in this next segment, we definitely wanted to talk about some real concrete ways in which and things that you can do, some tips, some tools, not talking about this high level thing, but really talking about what needs to happen in the fall. We don't know. We don't know if it's going to be business as usual. We don't know if it's going to, we don't know if we're going to still be in this distance learning or social distancing. But however, one thing I do want to say is things need to change, especially for students that are underrepresented student groups. Take an opportunity to go ahead and chat and please offer some comments of what you think should happen in the fall for teachers. What types of things or accommodations should occur in the fall for students? Go ahead and chat in the chat feature. Before we go on to talk about that, I was looking and thinking about, you sit in, and sometimes as educators, and sometimes in any industry, you talk about innovation and opportunities, and then you have that person that's whispering in your ear and saying, here we go again. So I thought this was a really funny comic strip about innovation and opportunities. So what we need is an overarching strategy to stimulate our innovation. Or you could stop smothering the innovation we already have. That's the dumbest idea I've heard in my entire life. And there it is. So, you think about we putting these structures on these ideas. This is the time to think outside the box. Don't put a strategy around it. If it doesn't sound right, if it sounds wrong, this is the time to think differently and put it out there and try it. Let's try something different. Let's try something new. Take the time to do that. This new normal has brought both pros and cons. And, as we've surveyed, teachers and educators, many of them say that it's been positive or it has been negative. But we're going to change it to something that can be an opportunity for us in education, especially to make sure that we're bringing culturally competent practices. And so I'm going to go ahead. We're going to get into some real activities. I know we have about 10 minutes left. And so we may go over about 5 minutes because we definitely want to get some Q&A in. So if you could start queuing up your questions, that'll be fine. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lillian, who's only going to talk about some ways in which her staff and faculty are doing some supports around distance learning.
She's muted right now.
Oh, let me unmute you. There you go.
I think she has to do it on her end.
There
Can you
you
hear me
go.
now?
There we go.
Yep.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry about that. So my coworker, Sage, I didn't want everyone to hear her bark and join the webinar, so I had myself on mute. So sorry about that. Thank you, Jennifer. Looking at cultural responsive education, a lot of times folks go, I don't know where to begin. I don't know what that is. And really it's around those pieces that Olu and Mario were talking about, is that personal connection. Connection is a neurobiological need, and we have to feel connected to our students, and our students need to be connected or feel connected to us. I remember when I was an educator in a classroom, I had a student come in right at the beginning of class, and he was kind of laughing and giggling, and he said he had just failed his biology test. And I questioned him on why he thought this was so funny, because he failed it on purpose because he didn't like the teacher. So their vision and their lens is being connected. Currently, I have been working with a group of EL students at a middle school in my district. And there was one student in particular, a refugee student out of Syria, who felt no connection to any of his teachers. So it was my goal to make sure that I could feel connected to him. And I have my background on today as part of that kind of story. And I shared with him some of my story so that he could see some of that crossover and connection and feel connected. So when this all came about and the response to the COVID outbreak, he shut down. And I was connecting with my students via email, and he responded to me, and he had not responded to any of his teachers. And he had said that he couldn't even open up his email, that I knew it was about that he did not feel connected. He felt overwhelmed. You know, Mario was talking about the ACEs, and we talk about childhood trauma and all of how that fits together. You know, here in Utah, just recently through this outbreak, we also had an earthquake of a 5.7 magnitude, which is pretty uncommon for Utah. So we had a lot of people feeling stress and trauma and bringing up all of these pieces. And even myself, I had a lot of ups and downs, having loss of family, the earthquake. The day of the earthquake, I shut down. I did not even do 1 ounce of work the day of the earthquake because I thought, oh my gosh, this is one more thing. And I had to regroup, and I had to boost myself up, and I had to go back to who I was, that self-awareness, which was talked about earlier. Not only is it the educator's self-awareness, but the student's self-awareness. That's part of that cultural responsive education. So, you know, you can see all those pieces in there. I'm not going to go through them, but I am going to share one thing with you, which is share a personal item or object. So when you're online with your students and you're in a Google Classroom or Hangout or Zoom or whatever platform that you're using, ask them to share a personal item. And so I have with me, I think if I do this, you can see. So I'm trying to get my background, so I got to get that just right. But that is a design of a Navajo basket, and it just tells a story. And so I would share this story and life meaning around what that means in my culture. And then in my tin, I had done this as part of a professional development, is sharing story, is also where do they get their strength? And for us, it's a feather. What is your source of strength? What is going to help you through this time? And for me and my culture, it's that feather. And interesting enough, the timing was such, I also got a new fan for ceremony during this time and was able to be blessed with my fan and my feathers. So that has given me that strength that I need so that I can be able to support others in my community and others in their classroom and their support of students. So it's part of this synergy and part of a community that we need to work together. And these are just a few activities. Like I said, because of time, I'm not going to go into a lot of these, but reach out to us. We're here for you.
Thank you, Lillian. So I'm going to briefly just go through the lessons learned. Many of you said, I think one of the salient points, I think it was Greg who just put into the chat, Lillian, about, this is going to have to be an inclusive process and for this new approach, and everybody has to be involved. The whole community has to be involved, that we just can't tell staff and students what to do, that we need to involve everybody in this process. And so I think, it's important that we're giving ideas and things, but you're exactly right. We're going to have some accountability, and we need to start talking about it as a community around how we're supporting these students. So I think that was an awesome statement. Thanks, Greg, for that statement. In addition to that, just a couple of many things. Building social capital. You need social capital. Do you know some folks, teachers, may not have felt comfortable with using Zoom or using a lot of these platforms? And social capital is about building yourself up in order for your students to have something as well. This is a great opportunity to connect with virtual tours, also connect with guest speakers that maybe they couldn't have traveled out to, or tours that they couldn't have taken that you can do online, and to reflect. One of the teachers said to me, it took me out of my comfort zone because I then started looking outside for additional resources, for online resources, and it helped me to be a better teacher. Okay, Lillian talked about the feather, creating a representation of cultural identity in your online distance learning activities. A feather is meaning of strength. Maybe for other communities, it may have been the fist. For other communities, they're activism and empowerment. But how are we using symbolism, language, rituals, and imagery and music within our distance learning, so students can really connect to their history, connect to their culture, connect to connect to them on a personal basis. Last thing, empowering parents. I'm a parent and I'm homeschooling, and I don't have some of the barriers that are occurring, but I'm challenged. I'm surprised he hasn't come in, my son, right now through the door while I'm doing this live webinar. But there's challenges. We're trying to work all day, and I'm fortunate to be able to work at home, but there's some parents that aren't. And how do we connect to them? Because they need, to support, and they need that community as well. And so some of the things here, YouTube, sending them YouTube messages and Facebook messages and Instagram. Texting has really worked well with our community to parents, has been really, really great. And also allowing them to come into the classroom and share, that might be a supportive way of talking to others. Really quickly, I'm just going to go through this, Mario. Because Mario had brought this slide up. We talked about action planning. We want you to take away all the things that you've learned today and create an action plan. This is a good opportunity. When summer hits, it's time for you to take a breath, because we know that for educators, you need that support too. You're going through a challenging time. Who knows what has happened in your family base or the challenges that are going on in your home. But you have to take care of yourself first before you can take care of others. But take that time and think about sending out surveys or spotlighting best practices and doing some self-reflections. And now it's time to be not reactive, but proactive. Take record and notes. And I'm going to send out all these chats. Many of you had some great ideas. And so, first of all, when you're action planning, yes, it should be inclusive with the community. You should not do this action plan alone. But you need to start out where we are now. How do we need to get there in the fall? And where do we want to be? And as you're thinking about the action plan, I want you to think about that culturally framework, the context of where the students are coming from, the cultural competence pieces, the system that students are working in and being system-wide and systemic, and then the data to making sure that you're targeting your interventions through this action plan. There are resources that we are going to provide in the follow-up email. Some of you may have already received them around COVID and supporting you. And before we get to this piece, I do want to go ahead. Before we get to ending with the Q&A, I'm going to go to the Q&A because I definitely want to hear, are there any questions that we want to ask our panelists today. We're going to go over about 5 minutes, but I do want to find out, are there any questions that we want to propose to our panelists? And you can go ahead and chat into the chat feature. Any burning questions, comments, recommendations?
Jennifer, somebody had asked if anybody would be willing to host a healing session. And so I just have to ask Salazar, do you mean like via webinar? Or is this something that, you know, and then how can we, because I'd be willing to do that. I don't know if Lillian or Olu would be willing, you know, invested as well. But I know that that's something that I would definitely be wanting to do. And we can connect later after this.
Yes, I would too.
And we are gonna, there's other topics, and we were thinking about actually having a topic on social emotional support, and maybe we'll bring in other people for that as well. So we're thinking about doing additional webinars around that. Any other questions? Would any of you be willing to host a healing session? Okay. Yeah, and that we've thought about that. Awesome. All right, so I see that there weren't many questions that came in, so I'm thinking that we're pretty thorough in our presentation. But I do want, before we end today's webinar, for our webinar presenters or panelists to go ahead and leave our audience with a piece of information. And I'm only going to give you 10 to 30 seconds to go ahead and leave your piece of advice for everybody.
Okay, my piece of advice: children don't care what you know until they know that you care. That's it. They don't care what you know until they know that you care. That's my advice. You have to truly, truly show them that you care in order for them to be engaged. Thank you.
I guess all of mine together you can read there, but if I add them together, it's around understanding that culture is an asset and being very mindful in your practices. And that includes the healing piece. So I'm really glad one of our participants said that. As I've done my professional development, that has always been key with my educators around being restorative, and a lot of my traditional beliefs and in my customs and beliefs, I'm actually a healer. So I really appreciate someone who had mentioned that. And so I just want to say, bless you all. Thank you.
We cannot go back to the way education was. This is an opportunity. You know, I like to look at the silver lining of what's going on right now. We have an opportunity to go forward. We have an opportunity to rebuild our educational system. We can, you know, if and when we go back to our schools, it has to be different because it wasn't working completely great before. We need to be able to rebuild and do something different that is more modern, that is more, that brings more connection, that is more restorative for our students. And right now we have an opportunity to do that. Nationwide, we have an opportunity to create a movement right now that will revamp the educational system that we have, that we all know is important to our communities. And one last thing, teachers, you cannot do it alone. You need the administrator in your school to be able to work with you side by side. I've seen schools that try to do it without the administrator and it doesn't work. You need the parents, the students, the teachers, and the administrator to work hand in hand, because without the administrator, everything just, it cannot build or can grow as much as it needs to be. Thank you again, everyone. I appreciate you. Love you. Peace.
So I just want to leave, again, make sure you have take an opportunity to visit our website on bunifuelearning.com, also bunifuconferencing.com, where we're also offering virtual conferencing for businesses as well as schools and districts. And just to make sure that we want to make sure that our professional development is good and that we're providing right on information. So please take an opportunity to complete the post evaluation. That will be sent in a follow-up email directly after today's event. Please, 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 there's multiple choice questions, but there are also 2 fill-in-the-blank questions. Are there additional topics? We hear that healing is one, so I'm going to definitely ask that we have that session as well as an upcoming session. I think that would be awesome. And then also share any other recommendations or things that you're hearing that you're doing well, because we want to share that out with the group. Again, many of you asked, hey, is the recording going to be available? Yes, we'll send out the recording of today's webinar. Again, we're going to send out the chat with many of the things that you said in it anonymously, and then resources and tools as well. Again, I want to thank all of you. If you have any questions, please contact us. My email is there on the screen in the PowerPoint. Thank you, thank you, thank you to our presenters. You all were awesome. I really appreciate you all taking the time to prep for this and to get ready to present for this session today, and to all of our attendees. And also, again, thank you, thank you, thank you, teachers. I know this is Teacher Appreciation Week, and I appreciate what you're doing on the front lines.
Thank you.
Thank you.